This is the story of Barzillai, an old man with a generous heart and steady hands who stayed faithful to God's king even when the world turned its back. He didn't need applause or rewards. He just wanted to serve. Because true loyalty doesn't seek recognition, just the joy of serving God's people. The sun was sinking behind the Gilead hills, painting the sky in soft strokes of orange and rose. Barzillai sat alone on a stone bench beneath his almond tree, staring out at the road that wound down toward the Jordan River. His hands rested calmly in his lap, though his thoughts were anything but still. He had heard the news. David, King David, was fleeing again. Barzillai exhaled through his nose. So, it's come to this. The breeze tugged gently at the hem of his robe as he looked toward the horizon. He didn't need to ask who was to blame. He already knew. Absalom, the boy with the handsome face and the rebellious heart. David's own son had turned the people's love into pride, and pride into war. Barzillai shook his head slowly. It's always the ones closest to you. His thoughts drifted back, like old horses returning home. He had never served in David's court. He wasn't a soldier or a scribe. But he remembered the first time he heard of David, back when he was just a boy with a harp and a slingshot. People had laughed then, but not for long. Barzillai had watched from afar as David grew from a shepherd into a warrior, then a fugitive, then a king. And through it all, he had believed in him, not because David was perfect, he wasn't, but because David had a heart that beat in rhythm with God's. That mattered more than anything. Now the same king who once danced before the ark was running barefoot through the wilderness, betrayed, hunted, weeping. Most people wouldn't lift a finger for a fallen ruler, but Barzillai wasn't most people. A soft crunch of footsteps pulled him from his thoughts. It was Tamar, the young servant boy, carrying a pitcher of water. "You've been quiet all day, master," Tamar said gently. "Is it true? What they say about the king?" Barzillai nodded. "He's crossed the Jordan. He's coming this way." The boy's eyes widened. "Alone?" "No," Barzillai said, "but nearly." They sat in silence for a moment. Then Tamar asked, "Will you send him anything? Bread, maybe? Or shelter?" Barzillai smiled faintly, his face creased with both kindness and sorrow. "No," he said. "I won't send him anything." The boy blinked. "I'll take it myself," Barzillai said, rising with the help of his cane. "David deserves more than a gift from afar. He deserves to know that someone still stands beside him." Tamar nodded slowly, understanding now. "Because he's still God's king." "Because he's still God's man," Barzillai answered, "and some of us haven't forgotten." That evening, while the rest of the land whispered about the rebellion, choosing sides in fear, Barzillai's household lit lanterns, packed supplies, and loaded carts with food and blankets, not because anyone told them to, not because they'd gained something from it, but because one old man remembered the kind of loyalty that doesn't fade when the crown slips. And far down the valley, King David would soon learn he was not entirely alone. That night, the stars hung low and bright over the hills of Gilead like candles in the sky. The roads were empty. The town was silent. But in Barzillai's house, there was movement. Quiet, purposeful, steady. The kitchen glowed with the soft light of oil lamps, pots clinked gently, fire crackled in the hearth, bread dough rose beneath warm cloths. Barzillai moved from room to room, slower than he used to, but just as watchful. He paused beside a servant girl who was wrapping bundles of dried fruit in cloth. "Make sure the figs are ripe," he said kindly. "David always liked the darker ones." She looked up. "You've met him before, haven't you?" Barzillai chuckled. "Number. But I've been watching him all my life." Outside, Tamar was helping stack clay jars of water into a cart pulled by two quiet oxen. He grunted as he tried to lift one, nearly tipping it. Barzillai appeared behind him and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Use your knees, not your back." Tamar looked up and grinned. "I didn't know kings liked water from old men's wells." Barzillai smiled faintly. "They don't come for the water. They come for the kindness." He turned to inspect the cart. 2 baskets of barley loaves, salted meat wrapped in linen, a few ripe melons, honey jars sealed with wax, and soft wool blankets for the older men in David's group. He nodded. "It's enough." Tamar wiped his hands on his tunic. "Are we riding at night?" Barzillai looked to the stars. "Before sunrise. I want the king to wake to something warm." Later, while the others rested, Barzillai remained awake. He sat in the doorway watching the dark hills like an old shepherd watching for wolves. The night air smelled of earth and distant cedar. Crickets sang softly. Somewhere, a night bird called. He wrapped his robe tighter and whispered, "So many followed David when he wore a crown. How many will follow him now that he wears sorrow?" The next morning, the journey began. Barzillai rode slowly on a gentle donkey, his feet tucked into worn sandals. Tamar walked beside him, yawning, holding the rope that guided the oxen and their cart. The path was rocky and steep in places. The river shimmered in the distance like a ribbon of silver. All along the way, the hills whispered with wind, no guards, no trumpets. Just an old man with a cart full of kindness and a heart still loyal. At the bend of the road, they paused. Barzillai looked out at the valley below, where a thin trail of people, dusty and bent, moved slowly through the trees. "There," he said softly, "that's the king." Tamar's eyes widened. "He looks tired." Barzillai nodded. "He's lost much. A kingdom, a son, a home." Tamar frowned. Why would God let that happen to someone who loves him? Barzillai didn't answer right away. He squinted into the sunlight, then said, "Sometimes God lets his servants walk through sorrow, so others can learn what real faith looks like." Then he tapped the side of the cart. "Come, let's meet our king, not with swords or shouts, but with breakfast." And so, 2 quiet travelers made their way toward a broken king, with no fanfare, no reward in mind, and no fear in their hearts. Just loyalty. Just love. And loaves of bread still warm from the oven. A cool mist hovered above the Jordan as Barzillai and Tamar made their way down the slope. The oxen moved slowly, their breath visible in the morning air. Here, the world was quieter. Even the birds held their songs a little longer, as if they too sensed the weight of sorrow resting on the king's camp. As they neared the edge of the river, a few of David's men spotted the cart. They didn't raise weapons, just stared with cautious, tired eyes. These weren't the strong, sharp-eyed warriors of David's glory days. These men were thinner now. Dirt streaked their faces. Their tunics were torn. Some leaned on sticks. Some leaned on each other. Tamar's steps slowed. "Do you think they'll let us through?" Barzillai didn't stop walking. "Kindness always has a way in. A tall man with a faded red sash stepped forward. His hand rested near the hilt of his blade, but he didn't draw it. "State your name," he said, voice hoarse. "I am Barzillai of Gilead," the old man said, bowing his head. "I've come to serve the king." The man blinked. "The king?" Barzillai nodded toward the camp. "I know where he is." The soldier looked at the cart behind them, at the honey jars glinting in the sun, the steam rising from the covered baskets, the soft wool blankets neatly folded. His shoulders dropped a little. "You're the first," he said quietly. "We thought no one would come." Barzillai looked him in the eye. "That's because they're waiting for David to rise again before they remember they loved him." The soldier gave a tired half-smile and waved them forward. "Go on, old man. You're expected now." Tamar let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. As they moved deeper into the camp, heads began to turn, faces lifted from bedrolls, hungry eyes watched as the oxen pulled the cart down the narrow trail between scattered tents. Someone whispered, "It's food," and the word traveled like wind. Barzillai stopped in an open clearing near a willow tree and tapped the side of the cart with his cane. Tamar hopped down and uncovered the bread. Steam rose in clouds. The scent of barley and baked figs drifted across the camp like a gentle promise. "Pass them out gently," Barzillai said, "with care." A small crowd began to gather. A mother with a baby swaddled to her chest, 2 wounded men with bandaged arms, an older servant girl with tears in her eyes. "You came," she whispered. "He said no one would." Barzillai didn't ask who he was. He just handed her a warm loaf and a folded cloth of berries. "Of course we came." And then, footsteps. He turned slowly. A man was approaching, taller than the rest, though his shoulders sagged from sorrow. His robe was dusty, his sandals worn, but his eyes still held the fire of a shepherd who once faced a giant with nothing but faith and 5 smooth stones. Barzillai bowed low. "My king." David stared at the old man and the humble cart overflowing with kindness. For a moment he said nothing. Then he stepped forward and placed both hands on Barzillai's shoulders. "You came," David said softly. His voice cracked on the words, "You came." Barzillai looked up, his eyes shining. "You may not wear your crown today, my lord, but you are still God's chosen." And in that holy silence between them, no one said another word. Not because there was nothing to say, but because loyalty had already spoken. David sat beneath the willow tree in silence, his arms resting on his knees, his fingers twined together. The sun had risen higher now, warming the back of his neck, but he still felt cold inside. Barzillai sat beside him. No words, no rush, just steady presence. The camp had quieted. Stomachs were no longer aching. Children had stopped crying. Even the soldiers' shoulders had relaxed, if only for a little while. Bread and honey had a way of softening sharp moments. David finally spoke. "Do you know what it's like," he asked, "to be betrayed by someone you held in your arms as a baby?" Barzillai didn't answer. He knew some questions weren't meant to be solved, just heard. David looked at the dust on his feet. "Absalom wanted what I had, but he didn't want my heart. He didn't want God." Barzillai watched the river flow past them in slow, silver ripples. "When you're a king," he said softly, "people think they know your life, but they don't know your heartache." David turned his face slightly. Why did you come, Barzillai? Why now? The old man smiled. Because it's easier to love a king when he's winning, but real love shows up when the crown is cracked. David let out a quiet laugh, half sorrow, half relief. Most of my friends have scattered. They were friends to your power, Barzillai said, not to your soul. For a while, neither of them said anything. The wind blew softly through the willow branches. Somewhere in the distance, an ox snorted. Then David asked, "Do you remember the early days? When Saul was still king? When I was hiding in caves and writing songs in the dark?" Barzillai nodded. "You weren't hiding. You were growing." David glanced over. "You watched me then?" "I listened," Barzillai said. "I listened to the way you trusted God, even when the night closed in around you." David shook his head. "I don't feel like that man anymore." Barzillai reached into his satchel and pulled out a linen-wrapped bundle. He opened it gently and held it out. Inside was a small round cake of pressed dates and nuts, glistening slightly with honey. "My wife made this," he said. "Years ago, she sent one to your men when you were hiding in the caves of Adullam." David stared at it, eyes wide. "I kept this one," Barzillai said, with a soft smile. "A reminder that even when you were hidden, you weren't forgotten." David's eyes filled. He took the cake in his hands, holding it like it was something sacred. "Thank you," he whispered. Barzillai nodded. "Eat, my king. Heal." And David did. He took a slow bite, and for the first time in many days, he didn't feel like a man running from a throne. He felt like a servant of God, surrounded by mercy. And beside him, the old man from Gilead kept watch, not with weapons, but with loyalty. The kind that shows up, the kind that stays, the kind that quietly helps rebuild what sorrow tried to steal. Later that afternoon, the camp stirred with new energy. Not the loud kind, but the kind that comes when stomachs are full and someone kind has looked you in the eye. Barzillai moved from tent to tent, not as a guest, but as a neighbor. He carried a pouch of herbs slung over his shoulder and checked in on those who were sick or sore. Tamar followed behind him, holding a folded cloth filled with dried mint and lavender. A boy with a swollen ankle sat on a flat stone, wincing. Barzillai crouched slowly. "What happened here?" "Tripped on a root," the boy muttered. "Didn't want to stop walking." Barzillai smiled gently. "Even warriors must rest." He pressed a warm cloth to the ankle and tied it gently with a strip of linen. "There," he said. "You'll still be limping when you reach the next hill, but you won't be alone doing it." The boy looked up. "Are you one of the king's men?" "No," Barzillai said with a soft chuckle. "I'm one of his friends." Farther down the path, two older men were sharing a canteen, their clothes dusty and patched. Barzillai recognized them from years ago. One had been a strong warrior once, the other a palace guard. He approached them quietly. "You've come a long way from Jerusalem." The palace guard nodded. "We couldn't stay. Not after what Absalom did." The warrior looked over at Barzillai. "You must think we're fools, following a king with no crown." Barzillai smiled. "Number, I think you're faithful." The warrior stared down at his hands. "Faith doesn't feed you." "No," Barzillai said, "but it keeps you standing long enough to be fed." He handed each man a folded bundle, fresh flatbread, a strip of dried meat, and a smooth stone from his own garden. "For the road," he said, to remind you where you've come from and who still walks with you. Back beneath the willow tree, David watched it all. He didn't speak, he didn't move, he just watched. Watched how Barzillai, the quiet old man from the hills, moved through his camp like a stream through dry land, gently, but changing everything it touched. Tamar returned to David's side and sat cross-legged in the grass. "He does this everywhere," he said. David raised an eyebrow. "Does what?" "Finds the cracks and fills them." David smiled faintly. "I used to do that." Tamar looked up. "You still can." And for the first time in days, David allowed himself to believe it might be true. Because sometimes all it takes to restore a king is the steady loyalty of someone who never wanted the throne, only the joy of serving God's people. And Barzillai, he was that kind of man. The sky had begun to turn copper as the sun leaned westward. Shadows stretched across the camp like tired arms, and the breeze grew cooler. David stood at the riverbank, watching the current slip past like time. Tamar sat a few paces behind him, tossing pebbles into the water, each one making a soft plunk. Barzillai approached quietly and stopped beside the king. "Will you cross again soon?" he asked. David didn't take his eyes off the water. "I don't know." Barzillai nodded slowly. "It's all right not to know, but the people will still look to you for direction." David exhaled. "And what do I give them? A broken home? A torn robe? A war against my own son?" "You give them something better," Barzillai said gently. "You give them a man who still believes God can redeem anything." David turned to him, eyes tired but clear. "You speak like a prophet." Barzillai chuckled. No, just an old man who's seen storms come and go." David turned back to the water, silent again. Behind them, the camp buzzed gently. Men patched sandals, washed their tunics, braided rope. The smell of firewood drifted through the trees. Life, in its own quiet way, had started returning. Barzillai slowly sat down on a rock, rubbing his knees. "You ever wonder," he said after a while, "if your best work was the work no one ever saw?" David looked over at him. "I never built a palace," Barzillai continued, "never commanded an army, never stood in a crowd to shout a king's name, but I've helped, quietly, in ways small enough to forget." David tilted his head. "And do you regret that?" Barzillai smiled. I think those are the kind of things heaven remembers best." For a moment, neither of them spoke, just the water moving, just the leaves shaking in the breeze. Then David stood and reached out a hand to help Barzillai up. "Well," he said softly, "heaven's not the only one who remembers." Barzillai took the hand. His grip was strong despite his age. David added, "When I return to Jerusalem, I want you with me. You'll eat at my table, live in the palace, rest your old bones with the king." Barzillai was quiet for a long time. Then he smiled, but there was sadness in it. "I've never served to be seen," he said, "and I never needed a reward." David looked at him with deep respect. "But thank you," Barzillai added, "truly." David nodded, slowly understanding, and the sun kept sinking, casting golden light over the camp, over a weary king beginning to hope again, and a faithful old man whose greatest victories were never written in stone, but carried in hearts. Because loyalty like Barzillai's didn't need a throne. It just needed love and the courage to keep showing up. Night had settled once again over the camp, wrapping everything in a soft hush. The fires were low. Most had eaten, spoken few words, and drifted into restless sleep. But Barzillai was still awake. He sat alone near the edge of camp, legs stretched out in front of him, back resting against a smooth stone. Above him, the stars blinked like old friends. The hills of Gilead felt close, like home, calling him back. Tamar came and sat beside him, arms wrapped around his knees. "You really don't want to go with the king?" the boy asked quietly. Barzillai smiled at the sky. "It's not that I don't want to. It's just I know where I belong." "But the palace," Tamar said. "It would be safe. You'd have food, music, even servants." "I already have food," Barzillai said. "Music too. Have you heard my goats at sunrise?" Tamar giggled, then went quiet. "But wouldn't you like to be remembered? I mean, by everyone?" Barzillai turned his head. "Everyone doesn't need to remember me, Tamar, just the ones who matter." Tamar frowned. "Like the king?" Barzillai placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Like you." The firelight flickered across their faces as Tamar looked down, trying to understand. "You mean your legacy is me?" Barzillai nodded slowly. "And my sons, my servants, the travelers I fed, the strangers I sheltered, the widow whose roof I fixed, the friends I stayed loyal to when they had nothing left to give. That's what lasts." Tamar thought about it for a long moment. "So, the best things you ever did weren't famous?" Barzillai chuckled. "Famous things fade. Faithful things stay." From across the camp, a quiet voice rose in song, one of David's men playing a soft tune on a lyre. The melody floated into the sky, low and warm. Barzillai closed his eyes and listened. "I'll go with the king a little farther," he said softly, mostly to himself. "But not all the way. I've walked far enough." Tamar leaned against his arm. "Then I'll walk the rest." Barzillai looked down, eyes misting. "Yes, little one. One day, you will." And under the open sky, among forgotten warriors, an exiled king, and a quietly loyal old man, the night stretched long and still. Because while kingdoms rose and fell in the cities beyond, in this camp by the Jordan, something better was being built. Legacy, faithfulness, love that didn't need to be loud. Barzillai's part in the story was nearly done, but what he had planted would outlive them all. By morning, a different kind of energy moved through the camp. It wasn't loud, but it was steady, like a tide turning. Men folded their bedrolls with more purpose. Donkeys were packed, water skins filled. King David stood tall again, speaking with commanders in quiet tones, pointing to maps drawn in the dirt. His robe had been mended. His face, still tired, held something new. Resolve. Barzillai watched from a distance, his hands folded behind his back. Tamar stood beside him, holding a loaf of leftover bread wrapped in cloth. "He's ready," Tamar said. Barzillai nodded. "The king is going home." Tamar looked up. "And we're going with him, right?" Barzillai didn't answer right away. He just watched the camp stir like a beehive waking in the sun. Then David turned and began walking toward them. The people stepped aside as he passed, some nodding, others placing hands over their hearts. When he reached Barzillai, he smiled. "You're still standing," he said. Barzillai chuckled. "Barely." David took both of his hands. "Come with me, old friend. Cross the Jordan. Return to Jerusalem. Let me honor you." Barzillai's smile faded into something softer. "You are kind, my king," he said slowly, "but I am old. I cannot taste what I once tasted. I cannot hear the songs clearly, nor feel the warmth of the palace floors. Why should I go where I do not belong?" David's brow furrowed. "Because you do belong. Because you were loyal when others fled. You stood beside me when the throne slipped from under my feet. You deserve to be honored." Barzillai squeezed his hands gently. "If you would truly honor me, let me go home. Let me die where I lived, among the hills that knew my laughter, in the house where my children were born." David looked down, moved. "I will cross the river with you," Barzillai added, "but no farther." Tamar's eyes filled with confusion. "But we're not going to the palace?" Barzillai placed a hand on his shoulder. "No, little one. My part is almost done. Yours is just beginning." Tamar looked down, the cloth in his arms growing heavy. David turned to him. "Then come with me," he said. "If Barzillai will not, let you go in his place." Tamar's eyes widened. "Me?" Barzillai nodded. "He'll care for you, teach you, let you grow in a place I no longer can." Tamar looked back and forth between them, between the only home he'd ever known and the king who offered something new. "I'll go," he whispered, "if you'll still need someone to carry the bread." David laughed quietly. "That's exactly what I need." As the camp moved toward the river, Barzillai stood still for a moment, watching the bustle, the banners lifting, the dust rising from sandals. He smiled. He had not crossed swords, he had not spoken loudly, but he had stayed faithful, and now he would walk the king to the water's edge. Because loyalty doesn't always follow the crown. Sometimes it stays behind to bless the land that raised it. The river moved slow and shining under the morning sun, its surface rippling with light. A wooden ferry, weathered but strong, rocked gently at the riverbank. The ropes were being checked, the oxen loaded. David's men were already lining up to cross. Barzillai stood at the edge of the water, sandals sinking slightly into the damp mud. His cane pressed into the ground. Tamar stood beside him, quiet now, clutching the same cloth-wrapped bundle he'd packed days earlier. David came up behind them and said nothing at first. He just stood there with them, listening to the wind. "This river," Barzillai finally said, "has carried many stories." David glanced at him. "It carried me once, when I was a boy fleeing Saul. It carried me again when I fled my own son. And now," Barzillai said, "it carries you back. Not just as a king, but as a man who has been broken and blessed." David looked down at the water, then at Barzillai. "Are you sure you won't come farther?" Barzillai smiled, lines deep in his cheeks. "I've crossed many things in my life, my king. Mountains, valleys, grief. But this is where I stop." He looked around once more, at the olive trees swaying behind them, the hills rising like familiar arms in the distance. "I want to be buried here," he said softly, "where my father's bones rest, where my grandchildren can visit, a quiet grave." David nodded slowly. "Then let me give you a gift before you go." But Barzillai lifted a hand, gently stopping him. "Let Tamar go in my place," he said. "Let him learn from your house. Let him carry forward what I began." David turned to the boy. "You are welcome with me, Tamar. You'll be given care, food, training, and purpose." Tamar blinked, trying to be brave. "Will I still see him?" he asked, nodding toward Barzillai. The old man placed a hand on the boy's head. "You'll see me every time you choose kindness, every time you serve without needing thanks, every time you remember that loyalty is its own reward." Tamar swallowed hard and nodded. Then David stepped onto the ferry, Tamar following behind, turning one last time to look. Barzillai lifted a hand in farewell. The ropes loosened. The ferry drifted out. And as the boat slid across the water, cutting a path through the river's calm skin, Barzillai stood still, watching until they reached the other side. He never said a word, but in his silence was a blessing. And in that crossing, a faithful king returned. And a faithful servant remained behind, content to have walked only as far as he was called. Because that too was loyalty. The hills of Gilead welcomed Barzillai home with open arms. The path was quiet, just as he liked it, lined with waving grass and crooked trees that bent slightly with age, like old friends bowing in respect. His donkey walked slow, careful with each step. A few birds flew overhead. A breeze tugged gently at the folds of his robe. He passed the well where his wife used to draw water in the early mornings. The stones were cracked now, but the bucket still hung from its rope. Farther ahead, the olive groves he'd planted as a young man stood tall, their leaves whispering secrets only the faithful would understand. Barzillai smiled. He hadn't missed the palace. He hadn't needed it. He reached his front gate and paused, resting both hands on the top of his cane. From inside, he heard the sounds of home, clay pots clinking, the low hum of a servant's voice, a child laughing somewhere in the courtyard. The gate creaked open as he stepped through. A younger servant came running. "Master Barzillai, you've returned." "I have," he said with a nod, "and not just to visit." They helped him inside and settled him beneath the same almond tree where he had once waited for word of David, the same bench, the same view of the winding road that stretched like ribbon toward the river. He closed his eyes and listened to the wind. A gentle peace filled him, deep, rooted, quiet. One of the servants brought him a cup of warm goat's milk. Another placed a woven blanket across his knees. They said nothing more. They didn't have to. Barzillai looked up at the sky. "I walked with a king," he whispered, "not for a throne, not for reward, just because I believed." And then, smiling faintly, he added, "And that was enough." He stayed beneath the tree until the stars began to blink into view. No crowds cheered his name. No statue would ever be carved, but in a palace across the river, a young boy was learning to serve like him. And in the quiet hills of Gilead, heaven itself had recorded every step of his loyalty. And so, the old man rested, not forgotten, not unnoticed, but wrapped in the peace of a life well loved and well lived. Because faithfulness always finds its way home. The days that followed passed slowly, like autumn leaves drifting to the ground, one by one. Barzillai no longer walked far, but he didn't mind. He spent his mornings beneath the almond tree, where birds would land near his feet and servants would bring him fresh water and stories from the village. Every so often, a neighbor would stop by, asking for advice about land or animals or some family matter. Barzillai never rushed to answer. He'd listen, eyes half closed, nodding gently. Then he'd speak just a few words, words that felt like they'd always belonged to the listener, waiting to be heard. Children gathered near him too, drawn not by gifts or tricks, but by something else, something steady. They'd sit cross-legged in the grass and ask questions. Did you really see the king cry? Barzillai would smile. Yes. Was he scared? Not of his enemies, he'd say. Only of losing what mattered most. Did he thank you? He did. But that wasn't the best part. What was? Barzillai looked up at the clouds, seeing him rise again. Some days he would sit alone for hours, remembering the way the river glimmered that morning, how David's face looked when he first saw the bread, how Tamar's hand trembled when he said goodbye. And though his knees ached and his breath came slower than it used to, his heart remained full. One afternoon, a young man came riding fast up the hill. He dismounted, dusty and breathless, and approached the gate. Barzillai watched him from the shade, tilting his head. "You've come far," he called out. The man bowed. "From Jerusalem. I serve in the king's house." Barzillai leaned forward just slightly. "How is he?" "Stronger," the man said. "He speaks your name often. He says he crossed back not with pride, but with the peace you gave him." Barzillai smiled. "Then let him keep it." The man reached into his satchel and pulled out a scroll. A message from the king. Barzillai waved it off, gently. "I don't need to read it. I already know what it says." The messenger blinked. "You do?" Barzillai nodded slowly. "It says thank you, and it says goodbye." The man stood there awkwardly, unsure what to do next. Barzillai lifted a hand and pointed toward the house. "Go inside. Eat. Rest. Then ride safely." The man bowed again and left. Barzillai leaned back, exhaling. The breeze carried the scent of rosemary and wood smoke. He closed his eyes. The king remembered him. The boy he loved was in good hands. The hills still whispered his name. And in a quiet corner of Gilead, loyalty continued to bloom, not in parades or songs, but in silence, service, and stillness. The kind that only heaven writes down. That evening, the sky burned gold and lavender, and the breeze carried the kind of stillness that only comes when something is ending. Barzillai remained beneath the almond tree, wrapped in his wool blanket, a cup of warm broth cradled in his hands. His fingers trembled slightly, but his eyes were steady, watching the sun sink behind the Gilead hills one more time. One of his sons sat nearby, quietly mending a broken sandal. Two of the younger servants worked in the garden, whispering softly so as not to disturb him. A few children sat at his feet, doodling shapes in the dirt. He looked around at them and smiled. "I won't be here much longer," he said, voice calm. The children looked up. "You're going somewhere?" one asked. Barzillai nodded. "Back to the one who gave me breath." "Are you afraid?" a servant asked gently. He shook his head. "Number. Not when you've lived with your hands open and your heart clean." His son put down the sandal and leaned closer. "What should we do when you're gone?" Barzillai looked him in the eyes. "Be faithful. That's it. To God, to His people, to the quiet work nobody sees." He glanced toward the distant road, where the river could barely be seen as a silver thread through the trees. "Most people will chase after noise," he said, "after titles, attention, applause. But loyalty, real loyalty, lives in the quiet places. It walks beside those who've fallen. It feeds those who are forgotten, and it never demands to be seen." The wind shifted, and the almond blossoms above began to fall, drifting gently like soft white feathers around him. Barzillai looked up and whispered, "Even now, Lord, you are kind." Then he turned to the group once more. "Don't build statues for me. Don't write songs. Just take care of this land. Feed the hungry, shelter the traveler, serve the king when he is weary, and love the Lord when it's hard. If you do that, I will never be gone." The children sat still. The servants nodded. His son wiped at his eyes. Barzillai leaned back against the tree trunk, closed his eyes, and breathed in the scent of almond and firewood. His work was finished. Not because it had ended, but because it had taken root in others. The house was still when dawn came. No rooster crowed. No children ran through the courtyard. Even the goat stood quietly by the fence, as if they too sensed something holy was happening. Barzillai lay in his bed, eyes half closed, breath slow and shallow. The room smelled of cedar wood, rosemary, and morning dew. His blanket had been folded neatly over his chest. His cane rested beside the bed, untouched. His son sat at his side, holding one of his hands in both of his own. A few servants stood near the doorway, watching silently. No one rushed. No one wept aloud. This was not a house of panic. It was a house of peace. Barzillai opened his eyes just enough to see the window and the sky beyond it, soft pink and pale gold. The colors of home. His lips moved, barely audible. "Is it morning?" His son leaned in close. "Yes, father. A new day." Barzillai gave the faintest smile. "Then it's a good day. To rest." There was a long pause. A breeze swept gently through the open window, stirring the edge of the blanket. Then Barzillai whispered, "Did Tamar reach the palace?" His son nodded. "We received word. He is doing well. The king honors him in your name." Barzillai closed his eyes again. "Good. Then I have left something behind." A silence settled again, but it wasn't empty. It was full of gratitude, of reverence, of quiet awe. One of the young servants stepped closer and asked, "Master, do you think the king will remember you?" Barzillai didn't open his eyes, but he answered, voice barely a whisper. "No," he said, "but the King of Heaven will." His breath slowed. One final exhale, and then he was gone. No trumpet sounded. No grand parade passed through the hills, but in the stillness the house remained full of something far greater than applause, presence, peace, and the quiet weight of a life that had been spent well. The almond blossoms outside began to fall again, soft, white, silent. And though Barzillai had walked his last mile, the road he left behind still shimmered with loyalty. The seasons passed. Spring brought new blossoms to the almond tree. Summer warmed the fields where Barzillai used to walk. And in the quiet hills of Gilead, life gently moved forward, but it never quite forgot. Children still played in the garden, often near the bench where the old man once sat. They told stories in whispers, how he had helped a king, how he had walked to the edge of a river with loaves of warm bread and no need for reward. His servants kept the home as he'd left it, modest, generous, always open to strangers. Travelers passing through were still offered food and shade, not because of a rule, but because of who had taught them how to serve. Sometimes his son would pause beneath the tree, looking up at the leaves with hands behind his back, just like his father once did. He never said much, but his eyes carried the same quiet strength. And far away, in Jerusalem, Tamar had grown taller. He wore robes now, fine ones, but he still moved humbly through the palace. He brought bread to the poor and listened to the concerns of the widowed and old. His voice was never loud. His name was not famous. But the king noticed. One morning, David called him into the courtyard. "You walk like him," David said softly. Tamar looked down, then smiled. "I walk because of him." David nodded slowly. "You remind me that some of God's greatest warriors never carried swords." Tamar lifted his eyes. "And some of his greatest kings never wore crowns." David laughed quietly and turned his gaze toward the hills in the east. "He was the kind of man I want beside me at the judgment seat of God." Tamar said nothing. He didn't need to, because Barzillai had not built cities. He had not led armies. He had not spoken to crowds, but he had fed a king when no one else would. He had stood by the broken when others walked away, and he had left behind a trail of goodness so steady, so gentle, that the world kept walking in it long after his footsteps faded. That was loyalty. And that was the legacy of Barzillai.